Dear friends, relations between the United States and China have historically reached their lowest point since they officially established them in 1979. Remember, both countries are the two largest economies that together constitute 40% of global economic output. One of the reasons why the world is concerned if relations between them worsen any further, which is exactly what is happening. On issues of trade, technology, human rights, defense, and more recently coronavirus, both countries have engaged in serious actions and accusations against each other. One example is China's order to close America's consulate in Chengdu. This in response to similar order earlier by the United States to close Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas. Question is, where will this end? This free fall in relations between the United States and China. Analysts are even beginning to wonder if the stage is being set for a new Cold War. If so, how dangerous will that be from the original Cold War? Because what happens is that in situations such as these, the risk of small disputes escalating into military conflicts is always there. Remember, the First World War was triggered by the assassination of an Austrian Archduke by a Serbian nationalist. One assassination, and the rest is history. So in this series of videos, we will have an overview of the current nature of US-China relations and will analyze factors that have caused this shift in their relations from cooperation to confrontation, starting with the trade war. The trade war between the United States and China, though it officially started in 2018, has its origin when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. The World Trade Organization regulates international trade between nations. So when China joined the organization, it was hoped, rather it was assumed by the United States that more trade with China will help advance America's own economic interests. Remember, China is the world's largest country by population and has always had a huge potential market. Therefore, it was hoped that by allowing China to join the World Trade Organization, it will be absorbed into a global economic system. And like any other state in the World Trade Organization, will be bound to follow its rules and regulations. But since then, since 2001, China has been accused of having failed to comply with those rules and regulations. The United States contends that China has instead manipulated them to suit their own designs, to serve their own economic interests. For example, China has encouraged bilateral trade imbalances. It exports more than it imports. In other words, it sells more to other countries than it purchases from them. Number one. Number two, China has been accused of putting pressure on American companies to sell their intellectual property in return for access to China market. This means that if any American company wants to establish its business in China, it must first enter into a joint venture with a Chinese partner, thus partially making it a Chinese company. Their Chinese company then receives rights to use the intellectual property of the American company to produce domestic products based on that knowledge. Only then that American company could gain an access to China market. Number three, China has failed to protect copyrights and patents. It's a major source of pirated musical and software discs, which according to Americans is costing them billions of dollars every year. In 2008, this time the World Trade Organization accused China of violating global trade rules after they required foreign automakers operating there to buy most components from local suppliers. If they didn't, they were threatened with tariffs, which according to WTO is a violation of global trade rules. Number four. Number five, industrial rules and regulations in China are less transparent, thus making it difficult for American companies to gain fair access to China market. As a result of these accusations, Donald Trump, after he became the president of the United States, has openly identified China as a main threat to the United States. Though he has always been vocal about these accusations even before he became the president, but now he wants China to make changes to what he says are unfair trade practices, and that these practices are costing American economy hundreds of billions of dollars every year. So what he did, he started by imposing tariffs on Chinese imports. A tariff is a government tax imposed on the goods and services imported from another country. What it does is that it makes those goods and services less competitive. It makes them more expensive, thus causing the company to suffer losses. So Donald Trump started by imposing tariffs on Chinese imports worth billions of dollars in July 2018, which officially led to the starting of trade war between the United States and China. China, on the other hand, has denied all these allegations and has instead accused the American government for starting the conflict. According to China's white paper in 2019 on US economic and trade talks, the United States' main goal is to stop China's growth. So in response to imposition of US tariffs on Chinese imports, China introduced its own set of tariffs on US imports worth billions of dollars. After 18 months of negotiations during which both countries kept imposing tariffs on each other's imports, the United States and China signed a deal on January 15, 2020, known as the Phase 1 Trade Deal. Donald Trump proclaimed the agreement as the
biggest deal there is anywhere in the world by far.
Under the deal, China has committed to purchase American goods and services, more of them, an additional $200 billion. To create stronger laws to protect intellectual property, copyrights and patents, to allow American companies fair access to China market, and finally to cut tariffs on US imports worth $75 billion. In return, the United States has promised to cut tariffs from 15% to 7.5% on Chinese imports worth $120 billion. Question is, how far will this agreement go towards easing of tensions between the United States and China? Though both sides have committed to the agreement and have promised its implementation, but analysts are skeptic about it. They believe that the Phase 1 trade deal is nothing more than a truce. It's a temporary arrangement, and that the underlying disputes between the United States and China require a comprehensive deal and not a temporary arrangement. For example, China's commitment to purchase an additional American products worth $200 billion is unrealistic, given the economic slowdown in the wake of coronavirus. Secondly, the deal still leaves tariffs on Chinese imports worth billions of dollars. And finally, the agreement requires China to protect intellectual property. Will China stick to these measures is difficult to predict for now. However, one thing is for sure. The trade war between the United States and China, the world's two biggest economies, if not brought to an end, will have far-reaching consequences for the global economy. The survival of the World Trade Organization is at stake. Donald Trump has already branded it as the single worst deal ever made, and he has repeatedly threatened to leave the organization unless it is reformed. So if the World Trade Organization comes to an end, possibility exists that countries will revert to protectionist economies, where they will restrict imports from other countries to rely on domestic production. This will be very detrimental to international trade and cooperation. In the absence of World Trade Organization rules and regulations, smaller economies will be forced to cut unfavorable trade deals with bigger economies and will have nowhere to look to for effective resolution of economic disputes. In other words, the strong will do what they want and the weak will suffer what they must. The former head of the World Bank, Robert Salick, who has also advised 6 US presidents during his career, has warned that the world could look like as it did in 1900 if countries don't work together to tackle this crisis between the United States and China. Secondly, trade wars and military wars are often interconnected. According to an economist, Emmanuel Martin, the Great Depression fragmented the world market and thus contributed to the rise of nationalism in 1930s, which was a major cause of World War II.